In 1972, Olelo Hawaiʻi had nearly disappeared from the Native Hawaiian vernacular. There were only about 2,000 native speakers still living. In a display of diplomacy and advocacy, Larry Kimura, a current University of Hawaii language professor, used the technology of the times to make his debut in the small community of Hawaiian language. The emergence of his radio show, Ka Leo Hawaiʻi, meaning the Hawaiian voice, gave the kahea that Olelo Hawaiʻi should and would be alive and thriving. It gave a voice to the generation that had been shying away from speaking the language they grew up with. With his diplomatic approach to the native language decline, Larry Kimura trailblazed a path for later generations of Native Hawaiians and other native language enthusiasts to advocate for their own languages. The Hawaiian language has a history of suppression that spans nearly 100 years. The arrival of the missionaries in the early 19th century was the beginning of a cultural suppression. Although they helped the native population transition their language from oral to written and offered a different kind of education, their descendants would use laws and codes to slowly diminish the use of the language. After the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1893, the Republic of Hawaii was established and led by Stanford B. Dole. This republic enacted Act 57, Section 30, which called for English to be the only language spoken in instruction by public schools. After the act was set in place, there were accounts of students being disciplined for speaking Olelo Hawaiʻi in schools. The strict policy of speaking English and not Hawaiian carried out many generations after.
No oe, pauke kula, kakau oe. Ele mahana ni laina, inuno o ka papa ele. May Olelo Hawaiʻi oe ka.
As a way to combat this policy and protect the younger generation from the harsh treatment, parents refused to speak Hawaiian in their homes. By the early 20th century, and with the promotion of English-only campaigns mixed with the sense of American nationalism during wartime, the language began to die out. Language provides a gateway to culture. With such, a suppressed language leads to a suppressed culture and identity. Hawaiian history, genealogy, songs, and chants were almost lost during this period. But, in the 1970s, a cultural revival began to take place called the Hawaiian Renaissance. During this time, many Native Hawaiians started to proudly fight and advocate for rights as Native Hawaiians.
Gave us a kind of hope that the beauty of our culture, the wisdom of our ancestors, could lead us out of this great deficit that we had fallen into.
Through his continuous efforts of language normalization, there'd be more options for the community to spark their own interests and start their Hawaiian language learning. It was in this atmosphere of change that Larry Kimura introduced Hawaii to Ka Leo Hawaiʻi. Kimura's persistence with the show, although attitudes towards Hawaiian leaned more towards the commodity than actual functionality, led the community's attention to Hawaiian causes and the rapid decline of the culture. Larry Kimura, a man of both Japanese and Hawaiian descent, became one of many leaders in the Hawaiian language renaissance. The peak of Kimura's diplomatic actions started at the Kamehameha Schools, a school founded for Native Hawaiian students, yet it hardly included the push for Hawaiian language. In the words of Larry Kimura, there was nothing Hawaiian being taught in school, yet we lived in Hawaii and had Hawaiian music and Hawaiian ways and customs. Debates continued in Hawaii about the want for more inclusion of Olelo Hawaiʻi, because many saw the language as gateway jobs for tourism, compared to it having any future functionality. Influenced by the times, Kimura sought to further his education in Hawaiian language through the University of Hawaii Hilo, and through conversations with his grandmother. In 1972, the significant decline of Native Hawaiian language speakers motivated the Hawaiian language activists. Kimura began Ka Leo Hawaiʻi by interviewing John Kameāloha Almeida. Writings and books weren't enough to teach Hawaiian. Knowing that the majority of the population of Hawaii hadn't heard the native tongue, Kimura sought to combat this lack of exposure with the radio. Between 1972 and 2001, 400 episodes were recorded and aired. Each 30-minute segment allows listeners to hear the authentic sounds, flow, different dialects, and the pronunciation of the language to better their own Olelo. The radio show aired on KCCN and was primarily run by students of UH Manoa, with Kimura at the forefront. He would invite guests to call in, which allowed for more interaction that Kimura could facilitate between the guests and the listeners. In creating a place for learning and sharing, Larry Kimura formed a collection of stories from Native Hawaiian language speakers that many could listen to and learn from. This allowed for a diplomatic approach to the language shortage. He listened and he cherished these kupuna who thought that no one cared about the language that had been silenced. He eased the worries of the language leaving with their generation. Through these recordings, he's immortalized their stories. He has created a place for them to be stored and never forgotten.
In the early days of Ka Leo Hawaiʻi, Larry Kimura made it a point to encourage the older generation of speakers that were shyer and more hesitant to reclaim their mother tongue. He also wanted to eventually extend this education towards the younger generation. Knowing that the radio wouldn't be enough to properly progress the language, Larry Kimura took a more interactive approach to further educate the community. The year 1978 marked the beginning of a new era for the Hawaiian language, where the language was recognized as the second official language of the state of Hawaii.
Started at Punana Leo in 1985, 86. We found out that we're doing another illegal thing, which is educating our children through Hawaiian. So we had to remove this law from the Book of Statutes, which is easily done because the best thing that we could have done as a legislature was to take our little children, 3 years and above, and demonstrate and testify in front of those legislators about how we are conducting our school. If they can't come down to school personally, we'll bring the children to them.
Aka mai kai, mai halo nui ka makahiki umi kumaiwa kanahiku kumavalu ka aha ho'oponopono kumu kana wai o Hawaiʻi nei. Ho kumu ia ke ia e kana wai e ho'olilo I ka olelo Hawaiʻi he olelo kuhelu o ka ʻaina, moku ʻaina o Hawaiʻi. A me ka olelo haole. Ai, o kākou ka mua loa a puni o Amelika hui puʻia. Keia manawa o Alaka. Mea ʻelua ka moku ʻaina ʻelua. Ka Hawaiʻi ka mua. E olelo ana o ka o Hawaiʻi. E olelo kuhelu. Aka ka waiwai o kela olelo ma ka pepa. A ahe waiwai I nā a ohe komo ke kanaka e hoʻiʻo I kela kana wai.
After the Constitution guaranteed Hawaiian language as an official state language, Kimura saw the importance of starting language learning with children. He worked with others to co-found Aha Punana Leo, the first Hawaiian immersion preschools in 1982. There were many other legal battles still to come. For instance, the teachers at Punana Leo did not have their teaching credentials. However, Kimura utilized the power of persuasion by demonstrating the need for the Hawaiian language to the lawmakers through the voices of preschoolers. He hoped that by educating children, they would in turn educate their own families, therefore slowly rebuilding the community. After seeing the success at the Punana Leo schools, many others became interested in learning their mother tongue. This resulted in the opening of 21 K-12 Hawaiian immersion schools and 13 other Punana Leo schools. Through Kimura's diplomatic efforts, the newfound accessibility and public exposure to the Hawaiian language gave way to a new age and generation of Native Hawaiian speakers. Today, Kamehameha Schools now requires 2 years of Hawaiian language to graduate, compared to when it was merely an unpopular elective at the time Kimura attended. Now you can take different courses such as conversational Hawaiian and Hawaiian culture. To this day, the Hawaiian Lexicon Committee continues to add 1,200 plus new words into the digital version of the Mamaka Dictionary, the second most popular Hawaiian dictionary. The effects of Kaleo Hawaiʻi and Punana Leo were not only felt in the school settings, but it was seen throughout the state. It was a long road of hardship to bring back the normalization of the Hawaiian language within Hawaii today. Larry Kimura has left an everlasting mark on the Native language community and has left people saying that the bare minimum books and optional classes for Native language revitalization is not enough. His works have sparked global debate as he states that the native language of a people must be used on the same level as its English or colonial counterparts. The efforts of Larry Kimura was not only the start of the resurrection of a language that was on the brink of extinction, it allowed for members of all ages of the Hawaiian community to reclaim an identity that had almost been completely severed from them. And it is through this reconnection that the people of Hawaii will continue to thrive and continue the legacies of our ancestors. E ala mau ka olelo Hawaii.